All right, we have Laura Opstedal. Sam's here as well. Laura, thanks for coming on. Can you give us a little brief intro on kind of your current roles and the company you own, and then we'll dive back into a little bit of your background.
Okay. I am a clinic owner in Bozeman, Montana. My facility's name is Build Physio and Performance, and we've been open for about 4.5 years.
That is a
And
very nice name, by the way.
yeah,
Yeah, I wanted a verb. So we went
that
with
name,
Build.
that and what's your Instagram handle?
Oh, for my personal one?
Yeah,
That's, Khaki Free PT.
yeah, that one as
Yeah,
well is great.
that's my side hustle.
Do you have any of your coworkers that wear khakis, or is it like legit
It's
strict
not
no?
allowed.
Got it.
The strict dress code.
Anything but khakis.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I
Nice.
could I could rock some denim jeans. That'd be okay.
Oh, I wear jeans every day. Almost every day. 90% of the time. Yeah, it's Montana.
Makes sense. So we have limited time, so I want to dive straight into the topic for today. So we're primarily going to talk about force plates, which you've had access to for how many total years at this point, Laura?
That's a good question. Probably 4-ish.
Okay. So let's start initially either right when you got them or the point at which you started hearing about force plates. When did you initially get exposed to them? And then what was the eventual decision to purchase them for the clinic?
I read about them for a while. I know my friend Scott Morrison used them quite a bit. And I just kind of felt like I wanted them to learn from more than to actually use them for decision making. So got them really just to mess around with and didn't realize how steep the learning curve is with those things. So it became kind of this love hate relationship. Most of the time, I think early on, I wanted to throw them out the window, but I would look at them more like a toy earlier on until I really understood them. And now I would say I use them quite a bit more clinically. So really just a tool to measure quantitatively what I was seeing qualitatively. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. We just got force plates in our clinic, and it is this overwhelm initially of I have a lot of data and metrics, but what do I do with this information? So that's what we're going to kind of sift out today, and we'll stay towards the ACL population because that's the your primary interest, and we can stick with that one demographic. So let's start with early stage rehab utilizing force plates, either in your clinic, what you all do, or how you could see it potentially be utilized in other settings. What would be the value of some type of force plate testing or training at this early stage post op for ACL reconstruction?
Early on, we use them more for training. So, like some visual feedback. So, we look at interlimb asymmetries, really like the first day we get them in the clinic. So, 3 days post op, we might have them stand on there and figure out where, where their weight distribution is interlimb wise, not intralimb wise. We can't see that part, but, and it's usually like the first visit or two. And then after a couple visits of just, standing on them, sometimes we're just standing on them, like if they're on crutches, we just stand on them and then we progress into things like a hip hinge or like a mini squat and just see what happens with the force time curves. And then after a couple visits, they seem to normalize. They can stand right on there and find their center point without looking at the screen. And then, as time goes on, we might, reintroduce them as we're going up and squat, weight, for instance, and see if they're starting to develop another interlimb asymmetry. So really more
And when you initially got them, was it pretty humbling in that early phase where it may have looked like they're distributing their weight pretty evenly, even in just a standing position or in early body weight squatting or light goblet squats, how much of a shift there was?
It was pretty, I wouldn't say it was mind blowing. I think it was just kind of expected, because you can kind of see it early on. Not kind of, you can see it early on. It's a little more hidden, I think, as time goes on, but I wasn't particularly surprised. I think I was more surprised at how quickly it seemed to resolve just with those early skills and then come back at periodic times, as you're progressing them. So I think that part was interesting for me.
So pretty much the main thing that you're using it for early on is just essentially weight shifting, monitoring load on each plate, and then incorporating it into training and exercises.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
If you, during that early phase, how much leniency are you going to give with the shifting to progression? So are you going to hold them back from, let's say they've started bodyweight squats to a box or just to whatever comfortable depth they have? When do you start adding some external load, and what's your kind of stopping point for progression?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's driving that per se. For instance, say I have a football player that comes in and tells me he's, um, squatting 400 pounds again or something like that. And I know what the quad index is because I also have an isokinetic machine. And I'm like, there's no freaking way, dude. There's no way that you're evenly distributed. And so we might squat, a similar amount on there and really show them that there is quite a bit of interlimb asymmetry still going on. And my suggestion might be to lighten up until we can normalize that and then rebuild from there. So it's not like we're on them every single visit.
So early in that acute phase, you're not using them as a biofeedback tool each visit. It may be
Correct.
every few sessions. Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
And then let's go more towards this mid stage. What now is the utilization and the focus for training and testing on the force plates?
Mid stage, I wouldn't say I'm testing. I think it's more monitoring, I would call it, because your quad symmetry or your force output or force capacity is going to drive a lot of the strategies. And so I know things are probably not going to look normalized in the mid stage. So we might do like a counter movement jump every time they come in and use it more as a longitudinal kind of monitoring just for fun, just for more data points. But I think as long as there's a muscle asymmetry, I would put definitely more certainty into our force capacity than the force plates. But I do like to
And with
see
that,
things sort of improve over time.
Yeah. Are you using that in the counter movement jump format the same way that you were looking at the weight shifting and amount of force on each side? Just to see how symmetrical it is or asymmetrical?
Not necessarily. I might look at each phase separately. So eccentric deceleration phase, concentric phase, and look at impulse and just make sure that that's increasing over time. The problem with asymmetries in that phase is we don't have a good limb to compare to. And so it makes it a little bit tricky. And so we're just gathering data because one-off testing is really useless, especially in that phase, because there is so much variability in asymmetry. It can change even in a healthy person, visit to visit. You really need about, I tell people, like 5 sessions So 5 reps in a session and then over 5 sessions, because it does change quite a bit. And so I think there's more limitations in that phase, and we just get the data points over time, and I like to kind of compare them to what I'm seeing on the isokinetic machine. And then remember, they haven't jumped and done anything like that in several months, because we're not using these for counter movement jumps until we're jumping in the clinic. So, yeah.
And during that mid stage or any of the stages, when you're utilizing it, is there a pretty easy way for them to cheat the test or the readings to where it's hard for you to interpret it just based off of the way they land or the variability within the test, as opposed to maybe a more constrained position like the biodex or the isokinetic you have in the clinic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's athleticism in a nutshell, right? So, if you have a capacity asymmetry, and you ask an athlete to jump, they're going to figure out a way to do it, whether it's intentional or not. So when you say cheat, it's, I think, kind of a normal thing, right? They just want to do the skill that you asked them to do. And it's nice to see things kind of like normalize over time as their strength comes up. But, as far as like intentionally cheating, like tucking the legs up or something like that, trying to inflate their jump height, not really. I think if your cueing is solid and consistent every time, you can alleviate a lot of those problems. Take the arm swing out, be more direct with your cueing. Don't allow them to tuck their legs. But we look at, some software will look at jump height. They'll calculate that from flight time. And then if you're using momentum, so they're looking at center of mass and change in velocity, they'll calculate jump height based off the momentum. So it's a little bit better way to avoid cheating, intentional cheating, by pulling the legs up and trying to increase hang time, those types of things.
Okay, so you had just mentioned the cueing. So for someone who is going to utilize a force plate or just do some type of jump training, how much are you going to cue and have them focus on the task or the shifting or their position versus something that's a little bit more slower velocity or a little bit more early stage, where it can be kind of that biofeedback tool when it becomes more of a performance or explosive endeavor? Does that cueing change?
Well, it depends on the question you're trying to answer. So, if you're looking at performance, then, that might, I don't think my cueing really changes a whole lot. I just have them jump as high as they can. So stand on the force plates, hands on the hips. I want you to jump as high as you can. So the less explanation, the better, because you want to try to illustrate what they would naturally do, because we're not using them for biofeedback at that point.
Got it.
Yeah, I think that's a big difference when you compare it to like the earlier stage. In this one, you're utilizing the force plates more so as a test, whereas in the prior was for biofeedback. So you're not having them jump and limit their jumping ability to have symmetry. It's to get data points to see what those different phases of the jump look like and how overall they're shifting load between legs.
Yep. Yep. And you don't, when their strength or their force capacity is still really asymmetric, I'm not trying to force them to jump symmetrically, because I'm just going to force a compensation that I don't want later on.
Going more towards mid to late stage with metrics and specific tests to actually mean something for either return to practice or these very end stages, what are the specific jumps that you're looking at on force plates? And then within those, what are the metrics that you're looking for?
So let's take counter movement jump, for instance. I like to break it down into phases. So I think about the eccentric deceleration. So as they're descending into a counter movement or a squat, I look at that separately from the concentric phase, so the push off. So I call it the brakes and the gas, because the asymmetries can switch. They might be more symmetric with their eccentric deceleration than they are with their concentric phase. So within each phase, I'll look at impulse, so force and time, duration, so how long they're in each phase, and then some performance metrics, maybe like jump height and RSI mod, those two things. Jump height is probably least of my concern, but athletes like to know how high they're jumping. So we just denote that too. But phase specific things are more of interest to me, and particularly impulse. So I know what their force capabilities are because of the isokinetic testing. And so this kind of shows me how they're expressing their forces within each phase. So if we've been working a lot on deceleration, I would expect, if they have good capacity, that I would see less asymmetry in that phase of the jump. And then maybe they're becoming more efficient at their jumping. So their duration is shorter as they're getting more efficient and as they're able to produce force quicker than before, if that makes sense. So I break it down. The metrics are similar in each phase, but try to keep it as simple as possible, because you can get 200 different metrics from these things. And if you really step back and say, why do I even have these? It's because I want to see how they're expressing their force. And it's usually a component of time, right? Because I have their force capacity based on my isokinetic machine. So let's see if they're producing their force quickly or efficiently. And then, so that's counter movement jump. I don't do a lot of squat jumps. Sometimes I do loaded squat jumps for my ski racers, because they can get a lot more asymmetric when they're under load. And I don't know if you guys ski, but they're moving against a lot of G forces. And so body weight is probably not enough to really determine if there's still a asymmetry present. So let's see what else. Single leg vertical jump. I'll look at that side to side. And then my least favorite is drop jump to vertical. So I've really gone away from using that test. I think the two-step tests are a little noisier, jump down and then straight up. So a repeated hop test, if you're looking at like reactive strength index, the repeated hop test is better for me. It's just like doing a bunch of pogos. I'm finding more value out of that, because I don't know if it's a skill constraining your output in a drop jump to vertical, or it's actually reflecting reactive strength.
The two questions: could you explain more on the reactive strength index and what that means?
It's so you're looking at flight time and contraction time, or ground contact time, and it's a ratio. So what I'll do is I'll just split it up and look at each thing separately, because the ratio can change if one your denominator changes, your numerator changes, or whatever. But it's that fast stretch shortening cycle. So that quicker amortization phase, getting off the ground and still producing a lot of force in a short period of time. That's essentially what you're looking at. And so like really, really end stage rehab, that's not something that I choose to do with some of the earlier testing. It's very, very late, because I think from what I see in the clinic, that reactive strength is sort of the last thing to clear up in most people.
With the that drop jump to vertical, so your thoughts are that repeat kind of pogos is providing similar information with a less like cognitively demanding task in a sense.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and some
And
people
then
just are not.
are you,
Go ahead. Sorry.
go ahead.
Some
You
people
got it.
just don't have the athleticism for it. You know what I mean? It just doesn't, it's like what are you measuring? You're measuring their ability to do that. But I
Yeah,
think
a lot of
for
people
like,
really struggle with like walking off a box, and so then they're
yeah, I mean,
uncomfortable with
there's
the whole
just
concept of it.
so many things that go wrong in that test for me to really put a lot of value in it. So I do think you would need this baseline coordination or athleticism to do it. If you tell somebody to, like, if you're doing a repeated hop test, it's sort of just like jumping rope, right? And everybody can conceptualize that. So jumping off something and then straight up is a harder thing to grasp for some people. I'm not saying I don't use it, but for most people, I just am not seeing the value in it as I would expect. And I know everybody's all about it with my jump app, but I think, I it's just not one of my favorite things. I question a lot of things about it. And I know RSI is very useful. There's some really good research on possibly not injury prediction, but some correlations with poor RSI and re-injury rates. So there is value. I just am not convinced that's the test to use. The other thing too is if you just watch somebody sprint, you can get a pretty darn good idea without putting a number on it what their reactive strength is because you're seeing it. So I guess it's like when you can no longer see things, then maybe it's worth measuring. But, that depends on how long we get to work with our patients.
Is there an RSI number in your head or in the research that you're shooting for or above?
I'm not sure with a hop test. We had them for like over 2.5, I think it was. I can't remember Flanagan's work, maybe. I'm probably butchering that. Somebody's gonna send me hate mail. Um, but for hop test, it's usually a little higher than what you would see on a drop jump to vertical. So, and it's two different skills, right? So you can't really compare one to the other. Your RSI will depend on what the skill is that you're asking, what you're measuring from.
Are you doing other tests beyond just jumping on the force plates, like a isometric mid-thigh pull or other versions?
I used to, but I don't anymore, to be honest. When we were doing isometric mid-thigh pull, we would look at peak force and then rate of force development, but it's kind of difficult to set that up accurately. So I'm not putting there's just so many other things I get better data from than that. Scott Morrison might kill me if he's listening to this because I know he likes isometric mid-thigh pull, but I mean, I'm lucky I have an
Yeah.
isokinetic machine. I can get force output from that. And then we all know how noisy measuring RFD can be.
And so you're using the isokinetic because you said that there's other things that you just find are better for you. So the isokinetics is basically that.
Not for measuring RFD, for measuring force capacity. So like peak force. But then you're looking at it from a muscle specific test, for quads, not the whole lower body. So like an isometric mid thigh pull would be not just quad specific, whole lower body strength.
Yeah, I test isometric with mid-thigh pull on the plates, and I just slide them into my squat rack, and I have a set height that I know for the individual athlete, and I can just put the bar in place and have them pull into it. It's going to be immovable, and it's pretty fast to set up, but I've got a wall-mounted rig that can't be moved. So I know for like clinicians that don't have that option, it can be tricky to set up.
Yeah, it's like strapping the bar down, like because you could zero the plates out and bring the bar against like the safety bars, maybe to lock the bar in place. But if there's too much movement within the bar, it's hard to say what you're actually measuring. Your RFD becomes less reliable if there's more give in the system. And that's where I conceptually have issues with. I was going to have my husband weld something that was like a some kind of bar with uprights that are all welded together that you could adjust and see if that would be easier to do than trying to rig up the bar. But when it comes down to it, if something takes longer than 5 minutes to set up, I'm probably not going to do it.
Yeah, I'll have to
We're
send you
busy.
a video of this setup. So like in my squat rack, I've got 1 inch holes, and then I can slide a pipe through the 1 inch holes, and so then it can't go up or down because it's stuck in the poles. And then I got the
Ooh, I like
idea from yeah, so I got the idea from this physio and performance gym in Australia. They have good videos of their setup, and they basically just have an upright that they keep in place, and then they have poles that can just slide, and they're I think there's 1 inch in diameter as well, and they're just 60 of them basically an inch apart. So
Oh, I
it's
love that.
really really quick.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If I might have to mess around with my squat rack, but I think that is definitely much more doable than trying to secure a bar.
yeah, exactly. Because obviously, like you said, if the slack is in the system, it's going to be questionable. Just like when you use inline pole dynamometers for different setups. Like I know that that's one issue I have when I set up mine with doing knee extension testing. Like it's can be a hassle to get everything in place so that it takes a long time to make sure that it's not noisy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What you had already mentioned some things that you've taken out of the utilization from testing, the mid thigh pull, that drop jump to a vertical jump. Anything else that you just realized was either too messy information or you have better options to test with the other access to equipment you have?
No, not yet.
Nice. Is there anything you've added that you didn't initially start with?
Um, well, I like doing like 505 tests, but that's not using force plates. If I could like insert them into the ground, that might be kind of cool, but I don't have the ability to do that.
What I know you and Eric, I don't know if you all co-lectured it or if he would just came to the clinic. I know you all had a specific seminar on, was it force plate testing and the isokinetic testing?
Yep. Yep.
Was
Co-author
there anything
co-author.
that was there anything that he did on either the force plates or the isokinetics that you either disagree with or you're like, oh, I don't do that, or I haven't even thought about testing or training in that?
I think we were really on the same page um, with that. He doesn't use force plates much, I believe. Uh, and here's the reason why is like in physical therapy, most of the time there's still a strength deficit, a force capacity deficit. And you really need to clear that up first before you start making decisions based off of force plate testing. Um, and so I think, I mean, that's one of I think one of the questions you were going to ask me was, what's an alternative for people if they don't have force plates? And I still would argue that some kind of dynamometry you'll get more bang for your buck, like hands down with that.
in the sense of you're still prioritizing getting the just peak output and peak force closer. That will probably clean up the large majority of these rehab considerations and qualities, as opposed to just trying to chase these more elastic and reactive qualities that are already later stage.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you're working on that stuff too. I'm not saying that we're just working towards peak force, but the majority of the time we're still working on peak force, 9 months out, 10 months out. And you kind of just hope everything sort of converges together, at the very end where you can do a final hop test on the force plates and see very little asymmetry. And that does happen. So I don't feel like we get to, 100%, side to side symmetry with force capacity and still have really large asymmetries on the force plates. We might have a little bit, and some of that is just maybe a learned strategy, or maybe there's still a little bit of fear going into a counter movement really fast. So it kind of throws stuff off. But most of the time by that point, our side to side asymmetries are less than 15%.
The side to side asymmetries from the force plate testing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. The phase specific.
What else? Stuff. Yeah. What else with, you had mentioned the skiing population. Is there anything that you're adding to the testing based off of the specific sport or population on the force plate? More specifically, you would utilize that, what you said, it was kind of a weighted counter movement jump for that population. Yeah. Anything else that you've made a little bit more specific?
No, I've thought about doing like an 80-second jump. I know Matt Jordan, if you read any of his stuff, he works with alpine racers in Canada. So he'll do like for 80 seconds, they're jumping I can't remember the frequency in there, and just looking at fatigue over time. The fatigue monitoring is sort of a newer area of interest of mine, because I have access to some Division I basketball players. And so I'm definitely not the expert or anything on that. I spent the entire last season doing counter movement jumps with 5 of the players once a week for the whole season. And I'm going to sit down with the athletic trainer soon and kind of look through our data and see if there's any usefulness in it. They're not status post ACL, they're healthy athletes. But looking at training load and how that affects asymmetries, and is there any prediction capabilities of what we're seeing? So probably do again next season. But I think that part's really interesting, and I want to learn a lot more about that. That went way off topic. I'm sorry. We went from skiing to basketball.
I'm gonna continue that conversation. Yeah, I think that, I don't know if you've seen some of the more research emerging. It's predominantly in, I'd say, the endurance space, but coming out of looking at fatigue resistance and durability as 2 general topics. It's like a huge central review. Have you read much of that research?
I have not. No. Nope.
Yeah, if you're interested, I definitely send some over. There's some great ones. It's a space that I'm interested in. I compete in endurance sports and then have a few that train here. But basically, they're looking at that sort of fatigue concept and how much of a detriment do you see across a race, and then what impacts or what's the underlying variable that would feed into that. And like right now, there's some newer research looking at, basically they think that it's at least in the world of cycling, that the individuals have the greatest durability, so the least detriment in peak abilities. So being able to maintain, for instance, your 30-second max wattage at the start of a race to the end of a race, who has the least drop off is reflected by who has done the most amount of low intensity work versus having actually done a lot of high intensity work.
Yeah, see, that stuff is super interesting to me. With our population here, we probably wouldn't do a lot of monitoring per se, because they're injured athletes. But I really did enjoy working with part of the basketball team, and just once we sit down on Monday and see if we see any trends in anything, I think that'll be really fun to look at.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I'd love to hear what you end up seeing. I'm fortunate that I work out of a facility where I do get to have injured and non-injured athletes, mostly non-injured. And so then there's this constant discussion of how can we take something like the force plates and implement it with them to do exactly like monitoring. Do we see any difference in their fatigue resistance or something like that? So yeah, if you notice anything, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, I'll give you a call after Monday. Yeah.
Laura, or wrapping up, what are big picture takeaways for individuals who, let's say, they just got access to some type of force plate? What would you just say is like, just think about this or avoid this for someone who's overwhelmed by the thought of utilizing this information in this piece of equipment?
Don't do it. Just kidding. That's not what you wanted to hear. I would say get your methodology squared away. Test as many people as you can the same way, and really don't get caught in the numbers. So one thing we talked about in the course is just looking at force time curves. What's a good curve look like? What's a bad curve look like? What do you see more often? Things like that, and just appreciate the curve, without really diving into the numbers. Are you seeing what you expected to see? Like take a good jumper and a bad jumper, and how does that look different? Just do like exploratory, use it for a toy before you start using it to make decisions. Because it's so many of the metrics are related to each other too. And so I think the more you start looking into it, the more questions you have and the more confusion arrives. But I have to remind myself, let's just see how they're expressing their force and just look at the force time curve.
Yeah, I think you said something earlier that was really good. On you like that measuring becomes more relevant when you can't notice something visually anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And you can basically, I think, reasonably extend that over to even like the force time curve. Does it look like it should?
Mm-hmm.
Because do you need to measure a ton with it if it just doesn't look very nice right now? You'd probably just be able to, generally target and work towards things versus having to try to isolate down their eccentric versus concentric ratio when you can just look at it and say, that's not right.
Yes. Yep. In our course, I just had a bunch of examples and had people try to make, observations and guesses what was going on. Just even without looking at RFD numbers, you can look at the slope of the curves and the proximate impulse underneath. You don't need the numbers to do that. If you do enough of them, you know what a good curve looks like. Unfortunately, with our injured athletes, we don't have any baseline testing, so we're not really sure what their normal strategy is anyway. But I think that that's my biggest piece of advice. Just take a step back and look and see what you see. Jot like one or two things down and see how that changes over time.
I think that's a good spot to stop. Sam, do you have any other final questions?
No, this was great. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so
Yeah, you
much,
bet.
Laura.
Thanks for inviting me.